Thank you all for coming to Phoenix Sustainability Initiative's main speaker event, the environment as a human rights issue. I'm Sri Marotra, third year in the college, studying environmental science and minoring in human rights. As I'm sure you can tell from my coursework, I'm passionate about this topic and excited to share it with all of you. I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker, Jacqui Patterson. Ms. Patterson is the director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program. She first became involved in environmental justice work as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer in Jamaica, where Shell oil contaminated the local water supplies. Later, she noticed that the U.S. lacked a gendered analysis of climate change and decided to empower women who are impacted by climate change through her Women of Color Climate Justice Road Tour. She also co-founded Women of Color United and has served as senior women's rights policy analyst for ActionAid, where she integrated food rights, macroeconomics, and climate change through a women's rights perspective. She has held a variety of roles: researcher, program manager, and activist, while advocating for gender, racial, economic, and environmental justice. Patterson holds master's degrees in social work from the University of Maryland and in public health from Johns Hopkins University. Ms. Patterson will be joined by Mark Templeton, clinical professor at the University of Chicago Law School, who will be moderating the conversation. As the director of the Abrams Environmental Law Clinic, Professor Templeton and his co-instructor oversee the work of approximately 20 law students each quarter and bring lawsuits against polluters and governments who violate environmental laws, as well as advocating for reforms to environmental laws and regulations. Professor Templeton has served as a trustee and executive director of the Office of Independent Trustees for the $20 billion Deepwater Horizon Oil Spill Trust. Prior to that, he was senior advisor to the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and advisor to the U.S. delegation to the UN Commission on Human Rights. He has earned an AB in Social Studies from Harvard College and a JD from Yale Law School. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Jacqui Patterson and Professor Mark Templeton.
Great. Okay, can you hear us all right? Great. First of all, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Sri and PSI. Here, a round of applause. I have been wanting to have Jacqui come to campus for probably 3 or 4 years now, since we at the Abrams Clinic over at the law school started doing work with her and some of her colleagues in Indiana and Michigan. And so I'm really grateful that Sri and PSI and student government helped make this event possible. And the Jacqui's busy schedule permitted it. So thank you, Jacqui, for coming. So I am going to start off by asking some questions of Jacqui, which could probably go on for a long time, but I will stop and make sure to open the floor up to you all and really look forward to your questions as well. So Jacqui, I just want to start off, for those who are not as familiar with environmental justice as a concept or the field, could you start off just by kind of explaining what that means generally and what it means in your work?
Yeah, sure. So generally, environmental justice is defined as the uneven distribution of the burdens and the benefits of the environment. So when they talk about environmental justice communities, they're referring to communities that are disproportionately negatively impacted by pollution and other environmental-based injustices. And then also it refers to the uneven enjoyment of the bounty in terms of the environment, and how some groups are more benefited by the wild lands and so forth and the wild places than others.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the examples of the things that you're working on these days to address some of these issues?
Yeah.
I was just thinking in terms of helping to make it concrete for people.
Sure. So one is working with communities that are facing these environmental injustices. So working with communities like Dixon, Tennessee, where the community had faced having their water supply contaminated because of the erosion of a landfill liner, that resulted in trichloroethylene getting into their water supply, and then the community not knowing that this was happening, and then drinking that water for years, and then finding out later that the community, this is the African American community that was drinking the water for years, while white American families in the area had gotten a letter saying not to drink the water. And so they only started to find out when they saw a rare, odd pattern of rare forms of birth defects and then premature cancers, and then that's when they investigated and found out that years ago people had gotten these letters not to drink the water. And so those kind of situations that we're dealing with communities across the country, helping them to find justice in those circumstances and helping them have relief from those kind of toxic exposures.
And in your work, I'm kind of stunned, frankly, that it wasn't that they weren't even officials weren't even aware. It was literally different notification, which led different communities based on color to take different actions with different impacts on their health.
And even the animal shelter had been put on an alternate form of water during that time. So it was egregious, and they did win a settlement because it was very clear. It was in the county records that these letters had gone out, and it was in the county records that they didn't go out to other folks. And so they won a $3 million settlement, but that was nothing compared to the loss of life and so forth that had happened.
How often in your work are you seeing these kinds of things which are so egregious on their face, like this, versus what some people might say is kind of a subtler, where they don't even bother looking, or there are not enough resources for this community for whatever set of reasons, and so there are discriminatory impacts from that. I mean, how does it kind of, I don't know, how does it break out between those kinds of things? Are you seeing a lot of the really egregious facial kind of problems?
You know, I do see a shocking amount of the most egregious, where, you know, places where there's these intense cancer clusters where it's just undeniable that, you know, other folks don't have these rates of cancer. One community, I recently did a panel at the UN Commission on the Status of Women, and one person on the panel was from Port Gibson, Mississippi, where there's a nuclear reactor there, and she talked about how since the nuclear reactor came online, all of the cancers that had developed in the community, premature cancers, and she spoke specifically about having 3 sisters, and she and all 3 of her sisters had each lost a classmate before high school graduation to cancer in that community. And so unfortunately those stories are all too common, those cancer clusters are all too common, but then there are other communities where folks don't even know that it's not the norm that, you know, half the kids in the classroom have asthma, and half the people in their church have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Like, they don't even realize that that's not what happens in the world, not like in all other communities. It's just, you know, just happening to them, and so it isn't as obvious to them, and then they're invisible to others, and it's because of the lack of monitoring and enforcement that happens around these exposures. You know, a lot of folks are kind of suffering and dying in silence and invisibility.
You were talking about these cancer clusters, right, which are places where there's much higher incidence of cancers or certain kinds of cancers. And while they're called cancer clusters, there are also other places where the people have a lot of issues such as birth defects, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Respiratory illness.
Respiratory illness, et cetera. How do you think about that issue in the sense that in terms of strategies? I think that often these places, maybe not always, but often these are places that have multiple industrial facilities, or it's the nuclear power plant, by the chemical power plant, by the petroleum refinery, by the cement. I mean, whatever the whole, it's a whole. So how do you think about, like, and in the local communities you work with, kind of think about the strategy for something, because it may not be just the permit for a particular facility, and is that facility emitting too much? Although it might be that, but it's a whole complex.
Right.
How do you all think about that?
Yeah, so it's a challenge, and unfortunately, again, there's too many communities in that circumstance. You have a place like Mossville, Louisiana, where it's that very thing where there's these cumulative, all these, it's in the petrochemical corridor, and they just have this this conflagration of all these different pollutant sources. And so the conversation there is, is this really just, like, do we fight this on principle, the fact that, that these facilities shouldn't be polluting these communities, or should we just really focus on getting folks out of harm's way? And that really becomes the conversation, because it's not right that the people would be the ones that have to move and have their whole lives torn asunder, but yet at the same time the reality is that it's not necessarily politically or economically viable to see those facilities move instead. So this becomes the struggle in so many places. And so you have a place like East Chicago, Indiana, where, I don't know if folks know about the situation there with the contamination of the soil and water and so forth from this lead. And it was so intense that, 1,000 times the EPA allowable amount of arsenic and lead in the soil, and 30 times the allowable amount of lead in the kids' blood there. And so they finally kind of condemned the area and said that the years and years of remediation weren't going to be enough, and or haven't been enough, and so it was not going to be enough. And so not only have they moved folks, it's not like they've moved the entire community. They've moved, some people have gone to Allgale Gardens here in Chicago. Other people have gone to other places in Indiana. So literally the generations that have lived together in community for years, the whole community no longer exists. And the people together no longer exist. Some families have even been split up from not being able. And so you have a lot of places that are in the circumstances of having to make those types of choices.
Mm-hmm. If people in that kind of community came to you and said, what should we be thinking about here, right? Because the community is providing us with bonds and the multi-generational aspects and things like that, but you also have this incredible contamination. How would you help them think through those issues?
Yeah, so one thing, just even looking now, because we also work on climate change, and you have in this place called Ile de Jean Charles in Louisiana. This community called the Ile de Jean Charles Biloxi Chickamauga Choctaw Nation that had to move because of sea level rise. And in that case, there was actually intentional efforts made to keep that group together and move them together. And so we actually called on some of the legal folks that we know, the law schools that we knew to get a sense of, like, what are the legal handles? Like, are there any legal handles to help people to be able to have the right to stay together and to be able to, and were they doing that based on treaty rights, or what exactly were the legal handles there? So we're still trying to find out, because we weren't able to keep people together with East Chicago as much as people wanted it. So that's all to say, it's an open question that we're trying to find the answer to, because we not only we have other communities that are having to move because of the toxins, but we also have other communities that are facing having to move because of sea level rise as well.
Mm-hmm. How do you think about your role in the national NAACP in the context of these local communities? So I guess that's kind of a more general question. What is the relationship of the national organization to the local communities generally, and particularly in your field? Mm-hmm. And then in a context like this, how do you help the communities, but maybe not impose your will coming from the national perspective? Or is there possible divergence of agenda in certain cases here?
So it depends. So the relationship, first off, the NAACP is the sum of its parts. We have 2,200 branches and chapters throughout the country, and they are the NAACP. And technically, if things are the way they're supposed to be, we're supposed to be in service to the agenda and the desires of our frontline communities, which is our branches and chapters. And so that's the idea. And generally, we try to maintain that. The times when it kind of diverges and we maintain it in a number of different ways. We facilitate visioning sessions with communities, and then out of those visioning sessions, we help them to develop a strategy to get to wherever they want to go as it relates to whatever comes out of the vision. And then we connect them to partners who can help them go to where they want to go. Sometimes, one of the times I was meeting with a community in West Virginia. It wasn't part of the visioning session, but in the course of the branch meeting, they started talking about going down to this job fair and holding a job fair for oil and gas, to get jobs in oil and gas industry.
So how'd that make you feel?
Yeah, so then that becomes a place where you're thinking, okay, what principle overrides the other principle? Because you have a principle of bottom up organized, and then you have a principle of like leave it in the ground and so forth. And so that's where you start to see some of those conflicts. Fortunately, in that case, I wasn't called upon to help host the oil and gas job fair, so I didn't have to make any tough choices, but
So that's where you would have drawn the line.
That's where I would have to draw the line. Yeah.
Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah.
So you talked about visioning. What other forms of support and resources does the national organization provide to the local branches?
Yeah, it's really that combination of the visioning, the facilitation of the strategy sessions, so like people will come up with their vision, like we want clean air, we want clean water, and so forth. And then we'll we'll facilitate things like developing a SWOT analysis and so forth. And
what is a SWOT analysis for people who don't know?
Yeah, sorry. Which is like deciding what the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats are to whatever it is the vision is. And then from there, figuring out what are their assets in their community, and so forth. And then from there, developing a plan to get to where they want to go, and then figuring out how do we eliminate the threats and the barriers, and then how do we build on the strengths and the assets and opportunities. And then from there, we will provide technical support in them doing that, whatever it is, or we will connect them with partners, whether it's universities or other nonprofit organizations who might have more expertise in one area or another to help them, or we'll connect them with financial resources if that's what they need in order to do what they want to do. And we'll also introduce them to models, like, okay, here was another community that wanted to do something similar, and here's a blueprint of how they did it, and they were successful, and here's how you could customize that to your situation.
So you have a long history of working on environmental type issues. How long is the history of the NAACP working on environmental issues, and how much of a priority is it for the organization today? In light of all of the other issues for communities of color and maybe even under the current administration. So where does environment, I guess, both historically and presently kind of fit within the priorities for the NAACP?
Yeah, so it's historically the communities, who have been on the front lines, whether it's folks in some of the historic kind of foundational cases that form the EJ movement, like the Warren County, North Carolina case around the PCBs, which stands for, I forget what it stands for even, but anyway, it's a toxin. And so the work that they did there in the front lines to fight against landfill violations and that kind of thing. And so NAACP was right there as part of that, because NAACP is in so many places, particularly in the Southeast. And so there's the communities who have been fighting these fights at the front lines for decades now. But then there is the national program, which just started 8 years ago. And so the national program didn't even come as a result of like a groundswell of these communities rising up and saying we have these environmental injustices. It really came as a result of this realization around the intersection of climate change and African American communities in particular, but civil rights in general. And even that didn't come through a groundswell. It was really one of the big green organizations who came and met with us, and another organization that had been funded to put together this commission to engage African Americans on climate change. And so there was this notion that the NAACP can really start to engage African Americans on climate change. And so it didn't start in that organic way, really, as a program, but in the first few years, since because I came in as a founding director, I started to have conversations with communities, and even though they didn't necessarily see climate justice or climate change to be directly intersectional with their lives, as we started to have these conversations, they started to see those connections, and it's grown as a program. We've particularly drawn the intersections between traditional environmental justice and climate change, and so in weaving together those connections, people have gotten more interested. And over the years, it's gone from being the smallest program out of the 6 program areas, which include health, criminal justice, economic justice, and so forth, to the largest department in the association. So it's definitely grown in that sense.
You're quite a director then.
No, just the needs are out there, I think.
Well, can you say more about the needs? Because in the sense that we started the conversation about environmental justice, and it largely started off with conversations about Warren County and toxics and landfills and people living adjacent to and birth defects. I mean, kind of your traditional litany, when we think about the traditional litany of environmental harms. How does climate factor into that? Where are the harms, and how does it harm African American communities?
So climate factors in both in terms of some of the traditional EJ is part of the climate continuum, because those same toxic facilities that are harming communities and their environmental health are the same ones that are spewing out the greenhouse gas emissions that drive climate change. So we see that.
So coal-fired power plants, chemical plants, okay.
Yeah, and even landfills and incinerators because of the methane that they put out. So all of these different practices that are harmful from a traditional EJ standpoint, many of them are contributing to climate change. So that's one key intersection that we see. And then on the climate change side, we see how communities of color, whether it's through Katrina or otherwise, are disproportionately impacted by climate change on the other side of the climate continuum. And yet are least responsible for the greenhouse emissions that drive climate change, because it tends to be wealthier communities that consume more, and the consumption is what's driving this climate change.
Do you find interest? So I can see the Katrina, the kind of, I'll say, coastal related climate change issues. Is climate change an issue with salience to branches and chapters kind of in the Midwest and other parts of the country that may not be having the brunt of things like Katrina or Harvey, or et cetera?
It depends. So to some extent, this is the importance of the first couple of years, which was helping to weave the narrative, like helping people to see the arc of climate change and see that entire continuum and where they fall on that continuum. So certainly in the Midwest, that's disproportionately host to these coal-fired power plants in particularly urban areas. They see that connection. When we also talk about the shifts in agricultural yields and drought and the effects on farmers, certainly with some of the rural areas, even in the Midwest and the plain states and so forth, people start to see the connection because they've seen how the agricultural yields have shifted. Communities of color are disproportionately sustenance fisher folks, and they've seen how their waterways across the country have changed. And so folks have definitely seen, and then also in the urban heat islands that we have in the Midwest and in Chicago, and we've seen some of the heat waves and how it's affected folks. So people start to see the impacts there, and they can see the differences over time, and we can really help folks to see the connection to climate change. So in that way, yeah, definitely.
That's interesting. How do you prioritize? I mean, it seems like you're taking on so much. Now, it sounds like you've got the biggest program, but I'm sure that there's more that you want to do than the resources that you have.
That's true. I mean, our program size is more than quadrupled, but the level of demands have risen exponentially. So even though we're the biggest program, we're the biggest that we've been, it feels the least manageable ever, like, and to a huge extent, not just a little bit, like hugely unmanageable. It's just unbelievable. And so, yeah. And so how do we?
But there are a lot of different places you could be playing. I mean, you could be spending all of your time in Washington. You could be spending all of your time in certain areas. You could spend your time just on coal-fired power. I mean, there's a huge range of things. So,
so we prioritize first and foremost being about working with our frontline community. So our first allegiance is to working with our branches and chapters and our state leaders to help them to know how to sit at their decision-making tables and make a difference. So whether they're sitting in, on some advisory council at the municipal level, or sitting in the halls of the public service, or the rooms of the Public Service Commission, or wherever it is that there's decisions being made, how they can be there and be influential. So that's our first and foremost. And then it's simultaneously we're helping them to kind of be the change they want to see in the world. So in some ways, the Environmental Climate Justice Program is a little bit divergent from the other programs in that while we're working on, it's a civil rights advocacy organization, so for the large extent, we're supposed to be working on policy change, but we also see that we also need to start to model the ways that the policies should shift by actually starting to pave that path. So so instead of just working on clean energy policies, we help communities to develop solar gardens and community solar projects so that they are then stronger when they go and they advocate for the Public Service Commission. They can say, this is what this means to me, and this is how it's helped me. And so we're being very kind of concrete in that sense in terms of helping people to start demonstration projects and pilot projects so that they can kind of be a living demonstration of what it looks like when we have the policies that we need.
What are some of the challenges that are faced in getting these pilots going?
So some places you need the policies before you can implement. So you can't really have an off-grid community solar project or an on-grid community solar project in some places because it's literally against the law. And so that's that's obviously a problem. We don't want to be leading people into jail. So
as a lawyer, I would advise against that.
So our legal department would frown on that as well. So that's probably one of our biggest problems, is that a lot of the things, because the things that we want folks to do, the ways that we need things to go are transformational. So by definition, they're things that aren't necessarily legal now because we want to change the laws. And so and then so with that, we have places where where we can do some of these things like California and so forth, but then people are like, oh, California, of course it's happening there. So it's not really it's not really the best example. So we were able to get, a solar project going in Fairbanks, Alaska. That was something we could hold up. We were able to get a project going in Pittsburgh. That was something people were, felt like, okay, well, if it can happen there, I can maybe do this as well. So, yeah.
What do you think are the unique or important perspectives that communities of color or African Americans can bring to the climate issue or renewable energy issue in their local communities? Kind of what's distinctive and critical about that? Aside from the obvious fact that the voice should be at the table, but what's the value, additional? What do you say is the value add there?
Part of it is pushing back on the dominant narrative, or some of the narratives around, because there's a lot of even energy companies will use this when they go into communities, like solar is only for rich people, or solar is only for white people, or these kind of things are for kind of hippie folks, and it's unattainable for like the regular person. So really making sure that frontline community folks, low-income folks, communities of color, that we really demonstrate that anyone can have access to this, and we can all do this together, and it can lead to economic justice for all, is a key benefit.
I want to shift a little bit to the Trump administration. And actually some action which the NAACP actually took recently, Scott Pruitt is, last I checked, still the head of the US EPA, someone at Environmental Defense Fund in a blog post recently said this, but I think it's probably said generally, right? Scott Pruitt has made environmental injustice the norm at EPA. And the NAACP, along with various other nonprofits, have called for EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt to be removed for office. I imagine that's not something you've done much of in the past, although maybe I'm wrong, but that's looking like a no. So why did the NAACP decide to makes such a request in this case.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, just because it's just so stark that he doesn't have the interest of environmental protection, which is the name of the agency, at the heart of what he's done. The history. It's funny. This fellow Reverend Tyrone Edwards in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, was talking about some of these appointments, and he said it's akin to putting Dracula in charge of a blood bank, and so just talked about kind of the contradictions there. But with Pruitt, I mean, you have this history. I mean, he's sued the EPA 17 times. He's sued the Potawatomi, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations for water rights. I mean, they're the ones who are supposed to be suing us for water rights, and he sued them as the Oklahoma Attorney General against them for water rights. It denies that that climate change is a human. It's a result of our actions, even though 97% of scientists have maintained that it is a result of our actions. So all of the things that are supposed to be, all his history just demonstrates that he's not in favor of the very things that we need to have a sustainable planet. So when we already had an EPA even before him, where they had their hands tied in a lot of ways from being able to make progressive policies that have the level of monitoring and enforcement that we need, that results in these, the very things that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation. To have someone who's actually making that, rolling back further from that already insufficient protection, is just untenable. I mean, it's yeah. So that was really why we just couldn't be silent in the face of that.
Yeah. What's your view, kind of generally, on EPA? Do people at EPA? Well, let me start with that. So, how do people? How do you think of affect how? Even putting Scott Pruitt aside for the moment, how effective is EPA at working on these issues?
I think, unfortunately, EPA has always been and continues to be, and even less so now. It's always been, I mean, more so now, it's been under-resourced, and therefore they haven't been able to fulfill their mandate. And so with all of these things happening under their watch, obviously they're not doing enough. I think that there's good folks in there. There's people who are very committed, and people who are just as, maybe not just as frustrated, but frustrated and sympathetic to the plight of communities, but as I said, their hands are tied because of being under-resourced, because the laws aren't strict enough. We don't have, when we have Corexit being used for the BP oil spill, which is banned in 90 countries, but it doesn't even appear on our list of toxics, and therefore the Corexit soaked waste from the BP oil drilling disaster went into municipal, the landfills that were cited for household waste. So we have those kind of circumstances that are happening, and it's because they just don't have enough in the way of the laws and in the way of the resources for monitoring and enforcement to do what they need to do. So EPA is just not effective enough because they don't have enough to be effective.
And a lot of this also takes place at the state level as well. And so do you see similar kinds of problems with the state environmental agencies?
I do, and then it's worse, of course, depending on the political situation in those states even. So there's under-resourcing in general, and then even more under-resourced in states where folks are either overly influenced by polluters, or they just are, it's not a priority to protect these communities.
Mm-hmm. In light of that, I mean, do you all think of, there are a number of different strategies, and maybe it varies based upon the circumstances, but educating people, organizing people, lawsuits. Certainly the NAACP, or at least the legal defense, has history of the lawsuit. How do you think about which of these techniques is the first technique you would go to, or kind of what's more effective in light of these problems?
Right, and so it varies again, because even if we thought, so litigation can be a challenge when there is, for example, Title VI, you have to prove intent in some cases.
And can you just, not everyone may know what Title VI is.
Yeah, so the Civil Rights Act. So you have to improve, like you can't just, it can't just be that this community was disproportionately impacted by something. You actually have to prove that they were intentionally poisoned. And so just because they are poisoned, it's not enough in terms of litigation. And so not only those kind of, the legal handles are insufficient, but also even when you might have amassed enough grounds, then you have these corrupt courts, and then you have the fact that we have Citizens United now, where corporations are seen as people, and so there's all of these challenges around the viability of litigation, and so we have to be picky about when it is that we employ it. We definitely employ it. Sometimes it's just it's a symbolic, like we might do it just to raise, in and of itself, raise awareness, but not necessarily intending or thinking that we're going to win a suit. So it depends, I guess, is the point there, of whether it's what our purpose is in doing it, and will we achieve that purpose in doing it. And so otherwise, yeah, with the other tools in our toolbox, education, organizing, using the media to gain. So sometimes we've been able to just kind of name and shame and have successes there.
Can you give me an example of where you've done that in the environmental justice work?
Yeah, the name and shame particularly.
Or any of these, I mean, where these strategies have been, you think, useful in achieving results for communities?
Yeah, so I would name the work that, a number of the coal-fired power plants in Chicago, actually, with the Fisk and Crawford coal plant, the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, PERO, and then late to the game was the NAACP Southside Branch. They used all these tools in their toolbox. They partnered with the Harvard School of Public Health to do a public health study on the impacts of these two coal plants, the Fisk and Crawford plants, on the community. They did a big media campaign. They did a lot of organizing. They did direct action in front of City Hall, and they developed a local ordinance and then put it before City Council, and the local ordinance put certain standards. It opened the question of what kind of air quality do we want, and it put like standards in terms of air quality, and then all that dialogue and organizing and conversations with even the plant owners and so forth resulted in the mayor giving an ultimatum to Midwest Generation, which control those two coal plants, to either clean them up or shut them down. And so Midwest Generation decided they didn't want to invest $1 billion to clean them up, and they shut them down. So.
In the climate space, there's certainly a lot of talk about cap and trade approaches to addressing greenhouse gas emissions. People talk about, we're at the University of Chicago, so we think about economic-oriented solutions. And people talk about greenhouse gas particularly because of the global nature of, at least it's presented as the global harms from those emissions, right? So the gases are going into the atmosphere, it's warming the atmosphere overall. So in some senses, people have thought, okay, well, this is a great example for cap and trade. Mm-hmm. But a number of the environmental justice organizations have been opposed to cap and trade. Can you say, in this context, can you say a little bit more about why that's been the position of the organizations?
Sure. So there's a couple of reasons why people, a few reasons, I guess. One, the biggest reason is because the concern is that if you cap emissions of carbon in general, then it's going to result in increases in pollution in certain areas that are already experiencing pollution burden, and so that's the dominant concern, and they've seen that play out, I think, evidently in some areas where they've employed this around the world, and so that's definitely the predominant concern.
So the idea would be if a coal-fired power plant reduces its emissions or shuts down, it's going to have to be replaced by a natural gas plant or something like that, which is cleaner in terms of its carbon emissions, but still emits CO2, and maybe it's located in a frontline community, and so that community experiences, and again, there's not as much sulfur, but there's nitrous oxides and things like that.
Yeah, that, and even that if it just gets to be more expensive to emit carbon in general, then they'll continue to even run coal plants, but run them in places where it's cheaper for them to run them. And then maybe a plant that only is like a peaker plant that only runs when there's peak need will run all the time. And those peaker plants tend to be in those communities that they consider to be hot spots where there's already other pollution going on. So like both of those are concerns to folks.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
And a number of I'll say the big green groups, maybe that's a term of art here, have different views on this. When I say big green, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, most people, when they say it, they're talking about these traditional big environmental organizations that have usually a conservation background. Mm-hmm. So I think, that's usually what I think of when I say big green.
So when you think of big green, so a number of the big green organizations have come out in favor of policies like cap and trade and things like that. So obviously we see some disagreements here. Are there other areas of disagreements with big green organizations? And more generally, how do you see the relationship between those larger organizations, those organizations, I guess is a better way of putting it, and your program at the NAACP and frontline communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that so whether it is being in favor of those kind of mechanisms that the communities don't believe in, and then not necessarily. So one of the challenges is since they are big organizations and they're influential organizations, they have a lot of money, then they're the ones who are making relationships with the federal government, and so they will be negotiating some of the very policies that end up causing harm to frontline communities, and they have the influence to do that, and some of them don't necessarily take leadership from frontline communities, where we think that frontline communities should be, as the ones who are most impacted by these environmental policies, they should be ones who are leading on the solutions. And so we've seen time and time again, even with the Clean Power Plan, the flaws in the Clean Power Plan as it relates to some of the market-based mechanisms, and not necessarily enough emphasis on energy efficiency in some of the other areas. It was the architects of it was one of the big green organizations that really got in and helped to design this program with federal officials. And so, yeah. And then,
so how do you address that? Do you say, hey, well, like, what about us? Like, we need a seat at the table. Here's a counter report. How do you try to? Do you educate, organize, litigate? I mean, how do you manage those relationships?
Yeah, so some of it. I mean, so you've seen a whole range of things. Like sometimes people will do like an open letter to, like there was an open letter at one point to one of the big green organizations. There was another open letter to a number of them because sometimes people are not even realizing, they're just like an elephant in a china shop. They don't even realize what they're doing or the impacts of what they're doing. So that's kind of best faith scenario. Sometimes it's really pointing out to federal officials or government officials that there's another view, and as you said, organizing and building power and really presenting that alternate view. And sometimes it's putting together groups, like there's a group that's come together called the Building Equity and Alignment Group, which consists of the big greens. It consists of foundations that fund the big greens and grassroots groups all coming together and saying we need to be in alignment, and we need to set a table where we come together around common principles and practices and hold each other accountable to it. And that's definitely the most promising practice, because we do want similar things. We just need to get folks on the same page.
Great. In just a minute, I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. One or two more from me first. So some of your initial work was in gender issues. How does that work affect what you do now? And maybe how do climate and energy issues impact women differently, or as a perspective, a gendered perspective to that work, to these issues?
Yeah, so what actually led me to doing work on climate change was through the gender justice work that I was doing, particularly internationally, and finding that women were disproportionately negatively impacted by some of the by climate change in particular and other environmental injustices, and that women were least likely to be at the decision-making tables, whether at the helm of big green organizations or in government where decisions were being made. But yet studies were showing that when women are in leadership, that resources are handled differently. There's more sustainable ways of operating, whether it's at the household level or at the community level. So this is what we're finding internationally. And so I was interested in actually what was happening here in that regard as well, and found similar patterns. And so whether it's the earthquake in Gujarat or Hurricane Katrina, after disasters, the incidence of violence against women spiked significantly. So that was one of the first findings. That you see that in disaster even after the BP oil drilling disaster, the domestic violence incidents in the police blotters quadrupled in some communities. And so that's one thing. Also, in terms of even on the other side of the climate continuum, in South Dakota and North Dakota, where they have these man camps where they do the oil drilling and so forth, you have this whole incident of, and they actually call it man camp. Anyway, they had this incidents of high levels of trafficking and drug trade and so forth, and these are often in indigenous lands, and so you have in these areas an extreme amount of missing and disappeared and murdered women, indigenous women who are impacted by these areas and those practices and trades that go on there. And then also in overseas, where, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where women's responsibility in the household was to gather water for the household, women were having to walk further to get water. And girls were having to miss school because they've had their duty was to go before school to get water and then bring it home, and then they'd go to school and then they'd come back home and for the day. But because they're having to walk twice as far to get the water, they don't have time to go before school and get back in time. And so girls were now, missing their entire education just because of this household duty that has shifted because of drought caused by climate change. So there's multiple ways that women and girls are disproportionately impacted. And one of the intersections of this violence against women and this walking further to get water was in South Africa when I was doing a focus group on female-controlled condoms. They were saying that they wanted female-controlled condoms so that the girls could wear them when they would go to get water, because that was the level of incidence of sexual violence when they would go to get water was so high that they wanted to wear them every time they were going to get water. So that, it was the most chilling thing I've heard probably ever. And so so these are the kind of things that really led me into doing climate change work in the first place, through that lens and through that work around gender justice.
Wow. I guess my last question before kind of opening it up to the audience would be, what role can those people, myself included, who do not live in frontline communities, do that is supportive of your work in communities on these issues?
Yeah. So definitely, and especially in these academic settings, we're seeing so many. We've been ourselves involved in so many relationships where professors or students, groups of students, have been instrumental in some of the work that we've done. A group of students, or one student actually, who is studying regulatory law, like utility law. Her professor said that his class had to do practical projects in order, as part of their studies, and so he asked me for a list of topics that would be useful, and so I gave them to him, and then and one of them was looking at utility shutoff policies. And so she did a great job on this question that I asked, and out of that we put out this report last year called Lights Out in the Cold, Reforming Utility Shutoff Policies as if Human Rights Matter. And that report has changed utility policies because people have used it to organize and push for fair utility policies, which is huge. They actually got in Detroit, the Detroit Edison, to be able the Public Service Commission actually forced them to have better energy efficiency assistance for low-income customers as a result of using that report, as a catalyst. And there's many, many examples of the same. Another group of students right now is working in Indiana University, Bloomington. This group of 20 students are doing their capstone project around low-income access to solar. So that's really exciting. Another group of students studied legal handles around gentrification and displacement that we're now being able to use to put together a toolkit on how to prevent displacement at the municipal level. And then the Harvard School of Public Health was instrumental, as I said before, in working with Chicago frontline groups around the coal plants, and they were able to find that when they teased out all the other environmental factors, they found that 40 deaths and 1,000 hospitalizations per year were attributed to the Fisk and Crawford plants, which was a piece of data that was critical in their education campaign and getting the public on board. So there's so many research questions and so many things that universities, students, and others can do to help communities in their campaigns and drive them towards success.
Well, I think, unfortunately, we've hit our time limit. I want to thank Jacqui for showing us and sharing with us about her work. And please join me in a big round of applause.